D is the sole authority to put on the wooden cross, Sakshila, 5th degree of royal initiation. And this was an adventure on which it was difficult for me to accompany my master, as 2 children had already been born. But with all our family, we went to the ashram to be with him. When we arrived, there wasn't a single place available, so we could at least sleep that night before tomorrow's big event. Because everyone, naturally, looked out for themselves, and didn't care if some of us had small children, or were in some other special situation. After all, we are all brothers and sisters. It wasn't like women and children first, but rather every man for himself. Some other people who were also unlucky joined us, and we had to go to a hotel in the town of Kottabek, near the ashram to spend the night. The suitcases were really uncomfortable, and I was also carrying one of the children in my arms, so it was a rather difficult situation. The next day, only my great love for my teacher moved me to do the impossible to return to the ashram instead of staying with the children in the hotel. Master Marcelli donned the wooden cross, an act that struck me as courageous, but at the same time, I realized that the antagonism with Master Diaz Porta was growing, something that ascending through more or less degrees did not help resolve. There were days when Master Marcelli performed the ceremony in one part of the ashram, and Master Diaz Porta, who was more senior, performed it in another, at the same time, but each with his respective followers and disciples. This wasn't going to end well. On one of my visits to my teacher, I mentioned that this could divide La Chifu solar line. But the teacher knew what he was doing. I stopped worrying too much about this, and as best I could, I forgot about it. The harmonic alignment of 1988. It was in mid-1988, or rather, in August of 1987, that Maestro Diaz Porta, as one of the leaders of the Mexicanist movement called MATIS, the Solar Indian American Commonwealth, which was a leader in Mexico, and known in other countries, issued a circular to the Aquarian community of the GFU, letting them know that the prophecy of the return of Quetzalcoatl would be fulfilled next August. He would return, and we would see him fly through the air. He then called us to meet at the pyramids of Teotihuacan, or at the Tool Tree in Oaxaca, where he would be present. Americo Living Trail 69 prophesied La Iniciación Armónica long ago by various traditions, primarily in Mexico, marked a shift for humanity toward the universal peace. This caught my attention, even though I wasn't supposed to be a disciple of Master Diaz Porta. When the date arrived, we headed to that sacred place. The plan was to sleep at the foot of the pyramids, and then climb the next day before dawn, to receive the first rays of the sun, standing at the top of the pyramid. I arrived with my partner, the children, my mother and someone else I don't remember. It was already dusk, when we settled near the Pyramid of the Sun, and that same afternoon, a foreigner from the United States approached us. He was young, dressed in white, and wearing no shoes or sandals. He said to us, "I'm a brother in Jesus Christ, and I want to see if it's possible you could give me something to eat." I was impressed by his demeanor, although I still felt he was human. Then my companion began to translate what he was saying, and we began to talk. He spoke a little Spanish, and explained that he had been fasting for 64 days, ready to die, or find the truth. That sometimes he would appear physically in a place or disappear. That he was here because, as the Bible says, kings would like to see what was happening, but they cannot, and that we were all privileged in some way. People sought him out, because he could see auras, so they said. It so happened, that we couldn't stay there, because there was an effort to charge an entrance fee, so everyone at the pyramids had to leave through the main entrance, and as it began to get dark, we were able to cross over, walking along the Avenue of the Dead. It was very interesting to see so many people at that time, and on that day walking along that avenue. And I remembered that in his circular, Master Diaz Porta stated that the Lazarus would rise and live again. It seemed that walking along this great avenue within Teotihuacan would allow us to repeat the passage from the Gospels, where Lazarus revived. We arrived right at the foot of the Pyramid of the Sun, and everyone was secretly jostling for places. So, with a little haste and good luck, I managed to settle my family at the foot of the Pyramid of the Sun, precisely in a place where the floor was cobblestone, not dirt. We spent the night there, as it was very difficult to sleep with such scant blankets. The next day, before dawn, my mother stayed to look after the children, and my partner and I, along with the brothers we knew, climbed the pyramid. At the top, I noticed a young man dressed in white with long blonde hair, like Christ. He was accompanied by a pleasant, somewhat innocent young woman who looked like his partner. We were anxious and a little nervous, and then dawn began to break. The sun, as it rose over the horizon, sparkled in multiple colors. Physically. And it lasted for more than a minute. It was unforgettable and unique. I started talking to people I knew, telling them to experience this, because it was unrepeatable. They, with a touch of mistrust, accepted my words as best they could. Americo Living Trail 70. It was around 10 a.m. when we descended the pyramid, and we noticed a rather young woman speaking to the crowd, explaining in English that this phenomenon refers to direct contact with the center of the galaxy. It caught my attention that she claimed to be an astrologer. She noticed our interest, and invited us to the citadel of Quetzalcoatl, where she performed the ceremony. The white man I said resembled Christ was also there, along with his partner. Our oldest child, 3 years old, could already walk, and had a red ribbon on his head, and because his hair was growing he attracted a lot of attention and they called him, the New Age warrior. The astrologer then confessed to us, that she was also a writer. She was pleased, because she had been having vivid visions connected to the pyramids and the entire site. When the meeting ended, we thanked him especially for everything he shared with us, and asked for our address. Shortly after, he sent us one of his latest books about Chiron, a planetoid located between Uranus and Saturn, for free. Perhaps he sent us this book specifically, because he found out I was also an astrologer. Her name is Barbara Handclough. It didn't take long for her to send us some letters, telling us she was willing to help us get ahead, as she too had experienced a lot of poverty in the past. By then, I was already a member of the Freemasonry, when he sent us some money hidden in one of his books. It wasn't much, in fact, it barely covered my expenses for about 2 weeks, but the act was moving. Then I sent her some personal writings, which my partner translated into English. She read them, but I had no luck, and little by little we stopped writing to each other. With the metaphysicists. During these years, I also had the opportunity to work with a group known as the Seventh Ray, who followed Saint Germain, and those people called the metaphysicians, because they primarily studied the formidable teachings of the enigmatic Saint Germain. They organized their school into levels. At the first level, they studied a book called Metaphysics, written by Mendes. At higher levels, they studied the Golden Book of Saint Germain, etc. I realized that they weren't really interested in approaching the solar GFU, and attached relative importance to yoga, vegetarianism, or similar things. What was fundamental for them were their fantastic invisible masters, especially those called ascended ones. They couldn't trust a flesh and blood master, except to rely on the invisible masters of wisdom. Americo Living Trail 71. I participated in one of his meditation sessions and intuitively received some messages that caught my attention. I once wanted to speak with someone I considered intelligent there. It was an advanced student, and I asked her if she knew Master Estrada. She said she didn't. This discouraged me a little, but I began to study all the books related to Saint Germain, and also others that were considered important there, such as Origins of the Adamic Civilization, Joshua, the Man of Light, Moses, the Seer of Sinai, etc. I was so enthusiastic that I compiled a thick volume of synthesis of the 2 or 3 volumes of Origins of the Adamic Civilization, all handwritten, typed. Later, a friend would stay with him. He was my partner, an astrologer with whom I tried to work later. Mendes wrote at the end of her well-known book on metaphysics, I kept a prayer journal for the entire week. Each day, I would ask the rulers of one ray. This would then extend the decree to the ascended ray, the archangel, the Elohim, etc. I couldn't practice this for the time being, but over time it would become the basis of my contact with God. The 1985 earthquake and my wholemeal bread business. 1985 was a difficult year for the residents of Mexico City, as an earthquake caused thousands of deaths, but the victims also received significant assistance from international charities. The earthquake began precisely when we at the Airport Institute were saying Pax at the end La Ceremonia, a very ancient scientific religious ritual taught by the Master of La Ferrier, which was practiced daily. And that day, as always before beginning our yoga session, it happened that something started to shake. But due to my powerful devotion and connection with the higher self, I wasn't afraid, because I was relaxed and very confident, which kept the others calm, as they didn't dare contradict my conviction. So we moved on to practicing yoga. But the surprise came when hours later, watching the news, I learned the extent of the tragedy. It was a beautiful and moving thing to see the reaction of people from around the world helping the needy people of Mexico City who had been left homeless. As for me, who had not been affected by a physical mishap, however, life was going to give me a little for my first child. When my first child was born, I didn't have money to buy clothes, baby bottles, and all that. But one of my relatives was a medical intern, and eager to serve, she volunteered to help these people in distress. She painfully told us how many took advantage of the situation and immorally stole everything they could from what was sent to the town. And when I say everything they could, it meant trucks full of various gadgets or food. Many things didn't even reach the people, they were simply taken home by those who had pretended to be temporary helpers to serve the people. Americo Living Trail 72. My relative saw my need, and was able to give me the bare necessities, to support our son for a while. It wasn't a massive robbery, but just the basics for a newborn. After a few months, the government began rebuilding the city, and made it easy for people who had previously been renting their own homes or even their own accessories to start small businesses. Some already had accessories, but others didn't, so it was a novelty that greatly eased the pain of people who had lost loved ones. In those days, a yoga friend was visiting us, and was interested in investing her little money to start a business with us. It was something like pooling our mutual misery. I would later realize that this friend was never willing to work, she simply took me on as her employee partner, so she could control me, or rather, exploit me. But this wasn't discussed like that, she actually felt like a savior to see me in utter misery. So she offered me a partnership. My friend was deeply moved and thanked her for her incredible philanthropic gesture. As for me, I had no choice but to trust in God through this sister. The partner took me to another person also interested in doing business, another poor person, who was included in the project. Inspired by this opportunity, the possibility of renting me one of these facilities for the homeless in the first block of Mexico City came along. Of course, these spaces were reserved for the owners only and couldn't be rented, but I wasn't far from being a homeless person myself. The rent was very modest and the contract was short-term, but I wanted to open a small business to try to get ahead. I had become a good baker with whole food ingredients, and we also decided to sell vegetarian burgers. It was all very idealistic, hoping that people around the world, or at least the country, would change their way of eating through our business. I cut the cost of the furniture we should have bought as much as possible, by welding the metal stools and tables myself where customers could be served. I built a bread oven and a small stove. It was all very modest for a small appliance, but I had hope. The first week I filled the carton to the brim with flavored water, because on our first opening day we gave everything away for free, handing out about 200 hamburgers and 2 cartons of water to people who walked by. However, the first week already had a price tag, and the water went unsold. People walked by, as if we didn't exist. I was learning the hard way to be realistic, to face the truth, and not how I assumed the world should be. As the days passed, I realized that people were suffering, chained to unforgiving jobs and miserable wages. This entire area was home to seamstresses and tailors who made shirts, suits, and other garments. These were fine clothes, the kind that later sell for a high price in prestigious stores. But for that to be possible in areas like this, the workers are overexploited. They barely had enough for their daily transportation and perhaps a trip to the movies on Saturday. And although some were forced to dress well, they were actually quite poor. Others, especially the women, were clearly from a very humble social class, and represented it as such. They had indigenous features, and wore bibs as uniforms. Americo Living Trail 73. So they couldn't afford the kind of food we offered, even though it was practically free. But they were thinking about survival, not the nonsense of becoming vegetarian. At a certain time, just after noon, between 500 and 1,000 people were moving around the area, but they passed by my little shop, as if half asleep, unaware of my existence, and they flocked to the nearest store or some street vendor that occasionally set up on the street. There they bought anything they could eat, and after half an hour of this hustle and bustle, they returned to their respective galleries, and in less than 5 minutes it seemed as if all those people had never existed. I watched them for about 7 months. Right across the street from my business there was a workers' union, and on the upper floor, seamstresses also worked, completely unknown to everyone. On the ground floor of the same building, there was a gym, and the owner, although not rich, liked me and became my friend. He bought me pastries every day, but he still didn't cover my expenses, so my time there was limited. Furthermore, I had made a bad deal with my partners. Around the 6th month, my supposed partner, my partner's friend, showed up, collected everything I considered his property, and left. I was practically working alone, as my maternal family kept trying to rely on me, and couldn't understand what I was needing. For her part, my partner cared for the newborn, in addition to being busy with all his mood swings, depression, illnesses, etc. Sometimes her hopes would spark for a moment, and then fade away. She realized this wasn't working, and was getting desperate. But as for me, I had to stay until the end. I didn't know exactly how this would end, and every day I arrived with a little raw material, made whole wheat bread, and sold it. I had a few customers who became attached to my products. I remember one day my partner arrived after several months of absence. She wanted to see how her side of the business was going. Of course, she didn't arrive ready to work, but rather to check on her business. Partly because of my temper, partly because of the unstable relationship with my partner, and partly because of a desire to soften her attitude, prompted me at one point, while I was supposedly giving her an account of the business, to give her a very good friend's kiss. She enjoyed it, and then became serious, remembering her friend, my partner, again maintaining her distance. I was pleased that her sense of friendship was stronger than her instinct, so I realized that kiss wasn't going to happen. But I began to suspect that I was no longer well with my partner. As for the business, one day what I had started with such enthusiasm ended. I never failed to pay the rent to the person who placed their trust in me, and lend me their equipment. I paid everything, and it cost me a fortune. I gathered my things, and stored them in a place that a friend of my mother's who lived nearby gave us, since she didn't even have the money to get to Netzahualcoyotl. So, I started looking for something else. Americo Living Trail 74. Paying debts to the partner. Since I still owed my partner money at the time, I had a serious conversation with my partner. For the first time, I decided to harass my in-laws, who lived in Chile, and were her parents. I explained the situation to them in a letter, and told them I wanted to start a business, so I needed some money. Her father, naturally suspicious of me, because he didn't know me, sent us a very small amount of money, but did help me pay off some ridiculously large debts, like the one I owed my fleeting partner. The day I went to pay him at his house in Netzahualcoyotl, I saw he was quite poor. His mother was having a neurotic attack when I knocked on his door, and when my partner opened it, she introduced me to her. But as soon as the woman found out I was her self-serving partner, she began to express all her anger not only at me, but at all of us who practiced yoga and those strange things, because we were abusive, useless, etc. My partner became concerned about the situation. I gave her the money, an absurd fortune, that amounted to 250 pesos, and she quickly got me out of the place. I returned home and was worried, yet happy to have made it to the end of this short experience in the business world. I have always loved my freedom too much. Emotional instability and the desire for another partner. In reality, I no longer felt comfortable with my partner, at least not as blindly as I had at the beginning of the relationship. No matter how hard I tried, and even though I was always faithful, she didn't care, and her sadness was wearing me down. It was only a matter of time before I reached the end of my tether. Love always makes me faithful, and I was faithful to her, even though I had plenty of reasons to be faithful until, almost at the end of the relationship, I decided that it would no longer be that way. It was a conscious decision. Naturally, I kept the teachings of my teachers, Estrada and de la Ferrier. This doesn't mean I didn't have passion, in fact, it's a part of me. And, by the way, speaking of passion, I want to briefly talk about when, already with young children, I was still working with my father and I went to buy some stainless steel sheet material at the grocery store, and a young girl of about 17 caught my eye. On the one hand, because her body was a little more Americo Living Trail 75 developed than that of a girl her age, and on the other, because of her unusual way of dressing in the Aquarian style, that is, eccentric, striking. It was like love at first sight. When I arrived at the place, I was telling some people, "Do you know your astrological sign? It's such a beautiful thing, astrology. You know, a lot of it is true." This made me look at her more closely, and then, while I was writing the note about my purchase, with many spelling mistakes, by the way, I continued to stare at her like a fool, and she with true innocence due to her young age. She smiled, open like a little girl, ready to learn about life, and, above all, to anyone with experience to teach her. I fell in love with her, but I immediately thought about the fact that she had a family and children, and with great effort for over a week, I fought against conflicting feelings, until I regained my senses, and was able to get her out of my head. I made no attempt to look for her Masonic initiation. I had already heard of Freemasonry, and knew that it combined the question of initiation, work with society, and the establishment of businesses called guilds. At least that was the case with traditional Freemasonry. So when I learned about the existence of white lodges of a Freemasonry founded on the teachings of Master de la Ferrier and Master Estrada, I was excited. Its members were required to be ovo-lacto-vegetarian, practice yoga, etc. In reality, not all of them met these requirements, but there were some people here who were familiar to me. These were lodges that, for the first time, also accepted women, since traditional Freemasonry only accepts men. I wasted no time, I went to the place, and wanted to be initiated. It was very interesting, because during this initiation, although I had no telepathic abilities, I heard a voice saying to me, "Saint Germain," and then Americua. The lodge in which he would be accepted was called Americua, which means the country of the winds. Americo Living Trail 76. I successfully passed the initiation, although the Master Mason I was assigned, was one of the strongest in this nascent Masonic movement for the Solar GFU. During the initiation, that Master Mason tried to intimidate me in many ways. The person being initiated with me, as he was finishing the initiation, didn't actually swear to be a Mason forever. On the contrary, the process was so intense for him, that he promised never to return to Freemasonry. Perhaps much of it was due to the strange, sadistic, and playful personality of my initiator. As for me, during my initiation into the apprentice rank, seeing that I wasn't moved by his games of humiliation, he took the sword, and heated it for a while over a candle flame, then threatened to burn my hand, but I thought, I've never seen anyone here with a burned hand, so it's probably just another one of their pranks. And since I wasn't moved, he finally bowed before his fellow Masons, and declared that he was now an initiate with the rank of apprentice. My young Mason disciple and the personality of his new master, a young man of about 16 years old who had been my friend at the time, when I moved to the middle of Jagnan, and he entered Yamines, was someone who liked me so much, that he liked to talk to me, seeing me as his teacher, and who I now met again here, inside the lodge. His teacher now was that tall man, the initiator who was almost 1.90 meters tall, who had initiated me as an apprentice, and whom I discovered, had a somewhat strange temperament. I remembered that this young and unstable disciple had drifted away from my life after the day he asked me, regarding his horoscope, if he would ever become a teacher. I told him no, because in this life he had to cover his opportunities, sextiles, and that perhaps, when he was mature, he could experience some of these harvest aspects, trying. After that day, he gradually drifted away from my life. However, seeing him here didn't make me feel repulsed, but rather a genuine joy at meeting him again. Although that fresh-faced adolescent with his humble and authentic attitude was fading, my friend was beginning to develop a strange sense of pride. He was about to become a Master Mason, but he appreciated me, and when I told him that the initiator, despite his personality, was a master, he was happy. A few days later, this young man, the initiator, and a servant were chatting at a subway station, and the initiator asked me what I was looking for in Freemasonry. I explained that Americo Living Trail 77, there should be a connection between initiation and business. He asked me what I knew how to do. I told him several things, but also whole grain bread. Since my friend had a bread oven, the initiator took a 50 peso bill out of his pocket, and handed it to me, so we could begin baking. Then he turned and left. It seemed like a lot of money to me, given the selfless act with which the Master Mason gave it to us. My friend and I stared at each other for a few moments, not knowing what to say. We became optimistic, and began making plans to start work immediately the next day. My comrade and I started talking again, like old times. I told him the initiator was a great person, but I confessed that I saw violence in his personality. My confidant trusted me, and told me things about his master. His sign was Aries, which made him a bit aggressive, but it wasn't so bad, since he had courage. For example, he had been taken by master masons from the White Lodges of the GFU from a tortilla factory, where he was working. One day they came to him and said, "Leave that, we need you." That's how he became a Freemason. My friend then revealed to me that before that, he had been a judge, and that his life had sunk to the bottom, to the point that at one point he had raped women, assaulting them in the middle of the night, along with his fellow judges. This hit me hard, but my idea of literal forgiveness was deeply rooted in me, especially with great hope, and also conveniently, because due to my economic and spiritual situation, I needed an urgent turn in my life. So I decided to forgive him, to acknowledge that he was changing, and that he had a lot to teach me. I started working with this friend, and at least that way I had bread to take home, and I was excited when the day of the 10 at 10 and give arrived. These were the weekly sessions I attended at the lodge. The initiator saw that I wasn't easily intimidated, unlike everyone else, who generally followed him more or less fanatically. I began to notice that this brother was well known, and that some in the GFU feared him, including some hierarchs, trying to win him over, hiding misgivings and negative comments behind a supposedly happy and universal friendship. Although there were some reverends who rejected him out loud, because they knew he was homosexual. His image was highly controversial, but when you were around him, you found a person who generally displayed a happy euphoria. He liked to be fraternal, open, and had a strong and inspiring way of speaking. He would, when the moment was right, burst out laughing. Americo Living Trail 78. You felt good around him. He gave you security when you didn't know what to do with your own life. But he didn't force me easily. So he made an effort to give me a little more of himself. Attending the meetings, I began to learn about his sadistic games, which, for the initiator, were a challenge to courage, meant to cleanse his disciples of all modesty and fear of sexuality. I was fortunate to be guided by my young former disciple, who, shedding the rigidity required by the Masonic degree, relaxed with me, and told me everything his new master really did and thought. That's how I learned that this man was what they commonly call a bastard. He took his disciples, eager to awaken their consciousness, and achieve great heights in Freemasonry, and in a park on the outskirts of the city called La Marquesa, he had everyone strip naked, and see themselves as they were, so they wouldn't be afraid of genital erections or anything like that. Some of my companions, whom I had met in yamines or in yoga, had already become corrupted in a rather ridiculous way by the time I met them in the lodge, with morbid desires that weren't as valuable as they seemed. And within these sensual initiation processes, which, although not officially considered sexual, were ultimately nothing more than disguised orgies. It would only take time for the degeneration to become apparent among the students of the not-so-white lodges. However, a balance had to be found, and it had to be done soon. When I found out about these situations, the first thing I did was act prudently and kept quiet. As long as he didn't mess with me, everything was fine. My young friend never ceased to surprise me with his information. For example, he told me that the initiator was the one who recognized Master Marcelli as an apprentice. According to his information, it was Master Estrada himself who told Master Marcelli to support Freemasonry, and that's why Master Marcelli agreed to enter the GFU Freemasonry. I don't know to what extent this is true. Furthermore, the initiator naturally laughed when, boasting about Master Marcelli's initiation, the initiator ordered him to kneel, and the master did so, when a Mason is supposed to kneel only before God, according to the Masonic regulations. This reminded me that at my own initiation, for some reason I didn't want to kneel, especially because of the aggressive way in which I was ordered to do so. Another interesting thing he mentioned to me was the initiator's way of thinking about sexuality. He said that, when a Mason meets another Mason's wife and likes her, he then tells her husband, "Your wife is nice," and the Mason in question responds, "It's no problem for me, if she wants." Americo Living Trail 79. Once again my young spy told me, that the initiator had spoken about me, commenting to me in his usual, animated tone of voice, and in cases like this, also severe. As for him, he said, referring to me, he's a dangerous person. The only thing left to do, is hope that, when he's about to commit suicide, we'll tell him, "Hey bro, don't kill yourself." I realized that the initiator mirrored much, of what he truly was in me. I found this interesting, especially because he was having a hard time subduing me, and I wasn't afraid of him. He detected in me a special inner spiritual energy, that was damaging to him, but at the same time a passion for initiation with which he identified. Thinking about it, I realized that the desire for transcendence and the desire for suicide are very similar, yet completely different. So, in the end, the one in that suicidal state wasn't me, but him. In reality, I sensed a need to be reborn. So what he was picking up wasn't right, but it gave me the opportunity to think, and learn a lot of things, like I hadn't done, before at the GFU. The child's agony, heartbreak and love. At that time my second son, 7 months old, was about to die. He had been ill, and my lack of experience prevented me from recognizing the progress of his illness. Then his mother remembered a couple of friends from the GFU who were currently living at the world headquarters as residents. He was a practicing homeopathic doctor, and under the guidance of a real homeopath they offered very affordable consultations near the Zaragoza metro station. Given the urgency of the case, we rushed to see him, but I was very sad that I couldn't afford to pay. His brother had to find out about my lack of funds, while he was examining our son. To my surprise, he turned to me in a friendly manner and said, "Don't worry, brother. It's my turn to serve you now. I don't understand why a GFWE you like to serve, but we resist being served." This left me positively thoughtful for a while. A few days passed, and the child did not heal, so I spoke to the homeopathic brother, and he told me, "Let God's will be done. If the child is to live, he will live, and if he is to die, he will die." Now it seemed to me a stupid philosophy, that threw away everything intelligent that had seemed to me. Americo Living Trail 80. That's when I finally came around. I finished my yoga session, and relaxed as much as I could with some special exercises, suspecting that no easy times were ahead. I grabbed the boy, and, followed by my companion, we headed to the General Hospital of Mexico. The boy was immediately arrested and transferred to intensive care. He was dying of pneumonia. Under these circumstances, even I would have been surprised by the special material I was made of, because in the face of unexpected danger, I forgot everything in life, to dedicate myself to caring for the child. I remained unharmed for 2 weeks, sleeping about an hour a night. I didn't leave the hospital at all. I practically went without food. I slept under a desk in the living room, outside the intensive care unit. Not only was this special, as many parents react this way to their children in these situations, but what was unique was, that I remained so intensely positive, that I was almost capable of laughter, to the point that when friends and relatives came to visit, I would entertain them with my jokes and they would even end up telling me their problems, because they forgot they were going to comfort me. But being happy didn't mean he was less aware of the delicate nature of the situation. I experienced some very special things during those days of retreat in the hospital, because I didn't have any money to pay for the blood donations and the treated food that the child was receiving through feeding tubes. However, I had faith. The team of doctors who cared for our newborn son were very close, which was helping make the miracle of the child's survival possible. They knew I was standing at the intensive care unit entrance, and sent me to the hospital across the street to bring supplies, tests, and other urgently needed items. Already at the hospital across the hall, as they were packing my items into a bag, I said, exaggerating my feelings a bit more, "I don't have money to pay." I must have been very convincing, or people still have good hearts, because they always let me take my orders and I never gave them a cent. I was experiencing the kind of retreat again. I was doing yoga in one of the gardens of the large hospital, and when the doctors passed by, they would see me standing on my head, or in twisting positions. They would make faces of surprise, perhaps trying to figure out what it was all about. For a change, one of these afternoons my partner would experience one of his meltdowns at such an inopportune moment that it would make things even more difficult for me. When that happened, I suspected it from the start, but at the same time, I didn't have the time or the ability to consider it. It all started when I had to take our son to the hospital, and I remembered that my initiator had offered his true brother's hand, warning us that anyone who calls himself a true Mason always helps his fellow Mason in need. So I called him, and he and my young friend arrived in their truck to take my son to the hospital. As soon as my friend saw him, she liked him. I don't know if it was because of his charming personality, or because she knew he was a leading Master Mason. Americo Living Trail 81. The initiating brother took out some coins, and gave them to me in the name of Freemasonry, and my companion couldn't take her eyes off him. He left, but he reappeared about 2 more times during my stay at the General Hospital of Mexico. Meanwhile, I concentrated on asking the sublime elder brother, Master Estrada, and the great masters of laws, that if it was their will that my son not be saved it was fine, but I remained firm to make sure that it was the will of the masters that acted. One afternoon while my son continued to die, my partner and I were walking through one of the large gardens of the hospital. She was nervous, and suddenly said to me, "I want to separate from you. Are you crazy, or what's wrong with you?" I replied, surprised. She started crying. Since I couldn't believe what she was saying, I decided to ignore it. It was enough to have the child in the situation he was in. I had become increasingly stronger in the face of all the little surprises this woman had been showing me. In addition, there must have been a higher power within me, because I quickly recovered from all the adverse situations that presented themselves to me like these, and within a few hours I was already remembering pleasant things. I reviewed the child's birth chart and thought it wasn't his time to die. I fondly recalled the sacred place where he was born, the public hospital very close to the center of Mexico City, how I was allowed to pay for his release with my blood donation, and, above all, something that particularly caught my attention was that when they handed him over to me, he was wrapped in an orange or ruby gold cloak like the ones monks wear in India and Tibet. In short, the boy was brave. 3 times, parents came out of the intensive care unit crying inconsolably. They were children who were with him and were dying. But he would survive again and again, until he conquered death after 15 to 20 days of threatening agony. But not everything was going to be negative, while I was watching over him, because good things also happened to me. The secretary of the World Headquarters. Since my time as a waiter at the World Headquarters, the local secretary, a young woman of about 19, became my friend. She was enthusiastic about Lao Fu, and had begun to practice yoga. She admired me, because she didn't know astrology, and was interested in it, so she asked me many questions about it. I liked having her around, as sometimes she seemed like a sun in the middle of the desert. Her sign was Virgo, and she represented this very well with her pleasant figure and modest, yet flirtatious, nature. Her face was what most identified Americo Living Trail 82. Her as a virgin. Although I don't know why her feet were very rough. Something strange compared to all her natural beauty. Tried to kiss her once, but she was surprised, and I discovered that she actually saw me as a friend and nothing more. I reacted in time, and decided to maintain her precious friendship. She was the one who was soon to be taken by my director of Jegni and to become his wife. As friends, she confessed to me that she neither loved nor disliked her husband. She was simply willing to learn and see what would happen. Shortly after, she had 2 children. The director of Jegnian and the fraternity. My Jegnian principal had a fiery temper due to his Aries sign and a very sentimental one due to his Cancer ascendant. He watched me, and treated me with respect, when I attended his Jagnian group, and when my son was sick, he was the one who urged all the brothers at school to raise money. A truly wonderful amount of money, that he personally brought to me at the hospital, and this is something I'll never forget. My 7-month-old son was in intensive care, but I wasn't alone. I knew it, when I saw him appear in the hospital corridor. He also brought me an envelope containing the card signed by all my friends and siblings from Jagnian school, all of whom claimed to be with me. A friend of fire. Also from before my son's illness, among my companions was an attractive woman, about my age, but she represented more maturity. She was from Monterrey. Her body was pleasingly contoured, and striking because she liked to dress up, complemented by a determined personality due to her fire sign. She fell in love with me, and I felt good talking to her. She had the degree in business administration. I really admired the fact that I had Aquarian children, and that their mother was a foreigner. Americo Living Trail 83. I remember that in some of the 7 o'clock morning meetings for the cosmic ceremony with Master Marcelli or a hierarch, he liked to take one of the children in his arms and jokingly say to his friends, "What do you think of my son? He's handsome, isn't he?" I always enjoyed watching her, and that was enough for me. But when she learned that my son was in critical condition in the hospital, she was truly moved. So, taking advantage of the moment and the trust she inspired in me, I offered her 3 of my Gurdjieff books, Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, to buy at a fair price. She gladly did so. This small amount of money helped me, because of the love with which she gave it to me. Shortly after my son left the hospital, this fiery friend was about to get married, or had just gotten married, and we were in the main hall of the Eugenia Center, where you pass through to enter Jagnian's school. She was sad, because her marriage wasn't working out, and she was seeking refuge in my friendship. At that moment, I didn't know what to do for her, so I hugged her, and gave her a long kiss. It was a truly brotherly attitude, but also full of sensuality. It was my way of showing her my love. She accepted it without question and calmed down. Shortly after, I stopped seeing her, and was about to meet her again, when I learned that she was a manager at one of Dr. Shayamichan's most important centers in Mexico City. By then, my astrology practice, in which I partnered with 2 other worthy astrologers, had failed, but they were as dreamy and humanistic as I was, although perhaps with less luck. Miraculous survival of our son. Anyway, still inside the hospital, as I left the intensive care unit with the child in my arms, I looked at the citadel adorned with a large garden. Less than 2 years ago, on the same site, there had been a special multi-story maternity building. But because of the earthquake, it had collapsed. It was a dramatic moment, as many of those involved had fought to save newborns, and there were courageous acts, such as those of the mothers who gave birth to their babies that day, and did not survive, but their babies did, because they gave their lives for their children. As I left the place with the child in my arms, for some reason I felt that a cycle was coming to a close in this hospital, due to our son's miraculous recovery. Americo Living Trail 84. When I arrived at my father's little workshop, which was quite close to here, my family was celebrating and happy, as the whole family had gathered in the workshop, and they had taken turns staying there. I was happy to see them together. Betrayal and fraternity. The boy was convalescing and trying to readjust my life when one night my partner was late coming home. But when it was after midnight, she appeared. I sensed something undesirable had happened. I stared at her, and felt an inexplicable repulsion for her. She was nervous, and lasted for about half an hour, then she began to cry, and told me she had gone to the hotel with my boyfriend. At that moment, I felt disgusted. The next day I went to visit Master Marcelli, and explained what had happened. Like a spiritual father, he was initially concerned, then, when I regained my composure, he began to speak. He said that this initiator had done many things before, and that he would find a way to stop him. Regarding my situation, he gave me a very clear recommendation. What this woman needs is a good spanking. I don't know if he was serious, but as for me, I always took what the teacher told me very seriously. So I returned home, and, like a true Machin, I took my wife by the arm, pulled down her pants, and spanked her hard, while saying, "The teacher recommended it." Maybe this didn't help me evolve, but I felt better. While after the beating, she cried with a red bottom. I made a superhuman effort, and with the help of my Aquarian pride, the image of becoming a teacher with Nazarene children, and my desire to keep my teacher, helped me forgive her. Shortly after, we would be introduced together again in the GFU community. When Master Marcelli saw us, he was filled with joy and told me, "I'm glad to see you together again." But I was no longer the same. I was changing. Since I was little, I believed that a true relationship was forever, but now I realized that playing dirty is common. However, I didn't know how I was going to get out of this mess. My companion, who used to see me as her friend, a rare friendship of convenience, began to tell me what had happened to her that day when she met the initiator at the hotel. Americo Living Trail 85. According to her story, she called him to talk to him because after the recent events, she was feeling very ill. Her brother told her they'd meet at a hotel and gave her the address. She innocently thought the meeting would be just to chat. Once there, he offered her a massage. Then he moved on to sex, but said he wasn't really that great at these romantic things. I didn't want to reason about all this, and I left it at that. Scandal in Freemasonry. My friend was trapped in her remorse and persistent depression, and since I wanted to do something for her, I suggested she go away for a few days with one of our good friends. She was a GFU sister who lived on the outskirts of the city, and she had long wanted to spend a few days at her house. Within the same area, lived he who was master of my lodge, Americo, as well as other brothers of the GFU. For work reasons and to avoid undue disruption, I couldn't be there permanently, but she and our 2 children could. While she was resting there, at one point she told the master mason of my lodge everything related to her affair with the initiator, and warned him not to tell anyone, and that if he was a man, he should keep quiet to avoid a scandal. Later, I had the opportunity to visit the home of my lodge master, and since I was selling my books to earn some money, I decided to give him the 6 books that make up the Secret Doctrine of Helena Blavatsky. I told him I was leaving them with the American Lodge. I was saying goodbye to them, and my brief career as a Mason. Still another day, I had to meet with this initiator in the lodge, but this time I wasn't swayed by his authority within the lodge, so I spoke about the Sublime Elder Brother and his teachings, and how things should be done. I left the lodge satisfied. My work, for now, was done. Later I learned that in those days the initiator, when he met Maestro Marcelli, would embrace him effusively, calling him my brother. The political issue within the initiation was disconcerting to me. This initiator was about to be appointed leader throughout the Republic of White Lodges, something like Master Americo Living Trail 86. But my friend, the master of the Americo Lodge, considered it more manly to speak out, and drew up a report in accordance with Masonic regulations, accusing the initiator of having seduced the partner of one of the brother Masons of the Americo Lodge. I remember that time I sent a letter to the Masonic community, that I share below. Open letter to my brothers of the Masonic community. June 4, 1989. White Lodges, to the glory of the great architect of the universe. Conventional democracy is a nonsense that cultivates the politics of vested interests, fostering the art of using the people to satisfy our personal interests. However, its most pristine essence is that the voice of the people is the voice of God. That's why in the great universal fraternity, I'm not referring only to the institution, the vote is systematically used to balance a decision. The monarchical aristocracy is based on the dignity of the human individual, elevated to the status of a child of God. However, it is obvious that, in historical experience, even the attempt at monarchies in some countries around the world has ended up being another democratic farce, to such an extent that it has been said that politics is the art of invoking the forces of the abyss. Despite these continued constitutional failures of nations in various eras, it is clear to recognize that as above, so below, and that democracy comes from below, where the society or peoples of the earth reside, and that monarchy comes from above, where the individual or celestial Adam resides. Thus, God is known through the human form, just as monarchy is known through democratic multiplicity in the diverse nations of the world. The chicken and the egg have always been, are, and will always be. God and man are one. Society and the individual are intrinsically linked, yet each has its place and neither can supplant the other. The Sower, Supreme Order of Aquarius, is based on the law of order and therefore on hierarchy, in the line of the masters, and allows the disciple to take the path individually. But this would not be possible without the presence of the honorable collegiate body and such respectable organizations as the White Lodges, where the society and its diplomatic activity are indispensable to prevent the SOA from becoming a mere religious clique, and thus maintain the universal brotherhood, which from heart to heart, is identical above as below, for the voice of the people is the voice of God. It is natural that, in this polarity between monarchy and democracy, the disciple becomes confused, by wanting to handle a matter in terms totally contrary to the most basic common sense. The people need the line of the masters, and the masters need the existence of the people. This is the dynamic I'm convinced of, but every institution that values itself as a universal brotherhood, as is the case with the White Lodges, does not. Nothing proves that we are initiates, until we prove it, that is, until the people recognize it. Within democracies, laws and constitutional legality supposedly fulfill their role of protecting the weak over the strong. Within democracies, such codes are necessarily wielded by individuals who, enjoying power and not being bound to any monarchical line, generally practice the art of demagoguery. They, Americo Living Trail 87 intimidate and subjugate the weakest people under the premise that the people want to be deceived. Let's deceive them. An idea from Xavier H., who wrote the play A La Allegrammadam. Within democracies, laws are made for the benefit of the majority and never for the individual. And within these democracies, it is natural that the more constitutional codes of infinite types there are, the greater the unconsciousness that is cultivated in the human kingdom. However, in the way that is not the ordinary way, idea of the Tao Te King written by Lao Tzu, the laws are simplified like that of, love your neighbor as yourself. But in these laws, though simple, dishonor and deception are not possible. We must live it firsthand, until we become this law. Every fraternity that worthy of universal status strives to, so the simplicity and dignity of life within democracy, for its capacity to do justice depends on it. And speaking of justice, I admire the movement of the stars to such an extent, that the matter of the judgment promoted by my brother Co has seemed natural to me, since in elemental horoscopy, Pluto is currently transiting over my Venus, House 8 Scorpio, square Uranus House V, however, Neptune, Saturn, and Uranus are transiting over my Saturn in Capricorn House X, sextile, partile, with my Neptune House 8. Conjunction to my Venus. It allows me to see the matter with a mature vision. Dear brother Masons, if CO promoted this, he must have had his reasons. His love and understanding of the Masonic Brotherhood was surely what committed him to it. Whether or not my brother Jorge is guilty is of no concern to me. My path is individual, and I reserve the right to prevent anyone from interfering in my personal life. It truly concerns only me. I trust more in the law of cause and effect than in simply making a judgment to satisfy a personal vendetta against someone. It's difficult to separate personal likes and dislikes in legal matters. We need to remove many prejudices before assuming that, because we like or dislike someone, they deserve or don't deserve a respectable position in an institution, and then perhaps justice can be done. Not to a person, but to a line of thought, like what the White Lodges are seeking, and that remains to be seen. However, in my humble opinion as an apprentice, I insist that the judgment of conscience is the only true one in the end. And if, in a moment of weakness and confusion, I had betrayed the Masonic rules, and harmed other people, especially if they were brother Masons, I would need to openly acknowledge it, and not lock myself away in my pride and political schemes, to prevent the truth from coming out. This would avoid a lot of wasted time and energy, but, above all, it would allow me to regain my dignity as a brother Mason, so I could get back on my feet, and start from wherever necessary. Well, that's what I would do, but I don't know of any others. In any case, as I'm not willing to fight this trial and claim respect for my individual primacy, I can only hope that the light will illuminate you, so that this matter may be brought to a successful conclusion. Sincerely, your brother apprentice. Americo Living Trail 88. P.S. I've been asked to sign a form stating that I waive any incriminations on a certain matter. It's a shame that, out of a bit of honesty, I can't do that. And if I were also asked to sign a form stating incriminations and making claims, I wouldn't be able to do that either. Thank you for your patient understanding. See my book, Memoirs and Initiatory Disquisitions, page 110 to 112. The trial proceeded, and he was no longer appointed director throughout the Republic. He suffered a kind of Masonic civil death. This is painful for them. I don't know what happened next, but I felt that there was divine justice and that, for now, many people had benefited. Back home, my companion continued strangely pursuing increasingly empty pursuits. One night I arrived at our friend's house and my friend told me that the next day she had to go see a friend nearby, to whom she was teaching special relaxation English techniques. I told her I would accompany her, and she reluctantly agreed. The next day at 5 in the morning we went. I was annoyed, because the time wasn't appropriate and the place, where they were meeting, was in a lonely part of the house, but I kept quiet. Our friend, who so lovingly offered us lodging in her home, was also a bit crazy, although the image she tried to present to others and the one she had of herself was decent. However, she was seeing a partner regularly. This wouldn't have been unusual, but their relationship was primarily based on physical attraction, rather than romantic stability. She already had teenage daughters and seemed immature. Still, I respected her, and tried to teach her about esotericism and astrology. She loved and respected me. Over time, this friend would find a way to catch Maestro Marcelli's attention, so he would consider her a good disciple, but this didn't change her fondness for wearing short skirts, and unsettling the brothers, while provoking them at the same time. She saw them as animals. It was a strange and unpleasant game. However, she was my friend, and I was lucky enough to be considered different from the rest of the fraternity. Although one day, by twists of fate, she would end up seeing me as the worst of all the fraternity members, whom, in keeping with the negative character of Virgo, her dominant astrological sign, she couldn't help but criticize. We had to return to our home in Netzahualcoyotl, and soon after, my partner contacted the directors of the Quinto Sol School for Nazarene Children again, to ask for a job, and they gladly accepted. Americo Living Trail 89. This forced us to move to the school, which, although it was no longer at the same address as when I met my partner, was nevertheless close to the old location. Once again I was going to experience a kind of retreat. The school, Quinto Sol. I worked occasionally with my father in his workshop. Metaphysics continued to attract my attention, and out of curiosity, openness, and curiosity, I agreed to go to a small apartment near the Portales Market. This was one of the places where they held sessions in the home of a sister who followed the doctrine of Saint Germain. When the class started, I realized I was already familiar with their teachings, having studied all the books they used at their different levels. I wanted to stay, but they had nothing more to offer me. So I didn't visit them again, at least not for that reason. Besides, they would never admit that I knew everything they taught without having studied it through their groups. All of this came back to me, because my father used to make deliveries at the Hidalgo Market, and sometimes at the Portales Market. It was around this time that my family and I had to move to the Quinto Sol School. We had 2 children, and were warmly welcomed. We were offered an unfurnished but pleasant room, especially because of the siblings' kindness, and because this room didn't have an asbestos ceiling, but a cement one, as it should be. For my part, that was enough. I was enthusiastic. I began to learn new things about the needs of children in the new age, but not in the pleasant ways one might think, but in ways that were little imagined. This was an elementary school, and the principal and owner was the kind brother who welcomed us, and whom I had met before at the GFU, but not behind closed doors, as was to be expected. The principal brother was the one-man band. His personality was a bit sentimental, and at the same time a fan of Big Brother, Estrada, which added flavor to our coexistence. He began to tell us about the miraculous way he had gained the trust of the former owner of the school, asking her to let him have it at a very low price, and that he would pay it as best he could. He had sold his house, and was now living full-time at his school. It was a fairly large, pretty elementary school in a good area,